You think you know what happened to women captured in Viking raids. Quick violence, maybe slavery, then life as a concubine in some Norse hall. That's the sanitized version. The reality was surgical precision designed to break minds, not just bodies. What Viking warlords did to high-status captive women in the hours after successful raids wasn't random brutality. It was calculated psychological destruction that turned queens into hollow shells and noble daughters into walking warnings. The process had a name in Old Norse. They called it mind-breaking. And it worked. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and Snorri Sturluson's accounts. Now back to the story. The targets were specific. Viking raiders didn't waste the mind-breaking process on peasant women or common slaves. They reserved it for captives whose destruction would send messages. Abbesses, who commanded respect. Noble daughters whose families held power. Queens whose humiliation would demoralize entire kingdoms. The psychological impact was the point. Break one important woman publicly, and hundreds of others would surrender without fighting. The Frankish annals record what happened to Queen Judith of Flanders in 879. Her husband's forces had fallen to Guthrum's raiders near Ghent. Standard. Procedure would have been ransom negotiations or political marriage arrangements. Instead, the Norse chose demonstration. Judith was subjected to what chroniclers called the 3 nights of teaching. By the 4th morning, courtiers reported she no longer recognized her own name or responded to direct commands. The process began immediately after capture, while shock and terror were fresh. Timing was crucial. Wait too long and victims might develop psychological defenses. The first phase lasted exactly 12 hours and involved complete sensory control. Captive women were blindfolded with leather strips, their hands bound behind their backs, and placed in total darkness. No food, no water, no human contact except anonymous touches designed to disorient and terrify. Archaeological evidence from Repton's Viking camp shows specialized holding areas for this purpose. Excavations revealed underground chambers with drainage channels, soundproofing made from turf and timber, and iron rings set into stone walls at specific heights. These weren't crude prison pits. They were engineered psychological laboratories designed to maximize mental pressure while keeping victims physically intact. The sensory deprivation created predictable effects. Medical texts from the period describe symptoms, hallucinations, loss of time perception, desperate need for human interaction. When Vikings finally provided contact after 12 hours of isolation, victims experienced intense relief and gratitude. This emotional response was weaponized immediately. The captors became sources of mercy rather than torment, even as they prepared for the next phase. Phase 2 involved systematic humiliation designed to destroy personal identity. Noble women were stripped of clothing and possessions, then forced to perform degrading tasks while being observed by groups of men. The specific acts varied, but the goal was constant: reduce proud, powerful women to objects performing animal functions under public scrutiny. Byzantine sources describe similar techniques used in palace interrogations, suggesting the methods spread across cultures. The clothing removal wasn't about sexual violence. It was about status destruction. Medieval women's identity was tied to their garments, jewelry, and personal items. A queen's crown, an abbess's ring, a noble daughter's family brooch. These objects carried psychological weight beyond their material value. Vikings understood this and used it systematically. They forced captive women to destroy their own status symbols with their own hands. Public performance of bodily functions was particularly effective. Women raised in noble households had been taught from childhood to manage basic needs privately and with dignity. Being forced to urinate or defecate in full view of male observers, while chained in degrading positions, shattered psychological foundations built over decades. The shame was intentional and cumulative. Each forced act made resistance to the next one more difficult. Food became a weapon of control. After the initial starvation period, captives were fed by hand like animals, forced to eat without utensils. While restrained, or given food mixed with substances that caused mild illness. The goal wasn't nutrition, it was dependency and degradation. Women who had commanded servants to bring meals were reduced to begging for scraps from their captors. Sleep deprivation amplified every other technique. Guards woke captives at random intervals, preventing REM sleep cycles necessary for psychological stability. After 3 days without proper rest, even strong-willed individuals experienced cognitive breakdown. Decision-making became impossible, memory fragmented. The boundary between reality and hallucination blurred beyond recognition. Language destruction was methodical. Captives were forbidden to speak their native tongues and punished severely for violations. They were taught degrading phrases in Old Norse, words for body parts, animal behaviors, servile acknowledgments. Women who had composed poetry or led court discussions were reduced to grunting single-syllable responses to direct commands. The intellectual degradation was as devastating as physical abuse. The third phase involved replacement identity construction. Once the original personality was sufficiently broken, Vikings began building something new, a hollow version designed for specific purposes. The process used a combination of rewards for compliance and severe punishment for resistance. Captives who accepted their new roles received better treatment. Those who fought back faced escalating consequences. Name replacement was fundamental. Captive women were assigned new identities, usually degrading nicknames that referenced their broken state or intended functions. Queen Judith became Guthrum's Weeper in Norse records. The Abbess of Whitby was renamed Christ's Whore after her capture in 867. These weren't casual insults. They were psychological anchors designed to reinforce the destruction of previous identity. If you value documented Viking and Norse-era history like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now back to the story. Sexual violence was used strategically, not randomly. The goal wasn't satisfaction, but psychological domination. Multiple attackers, public settings, forced participation of other captives as witnesses. Every element was calculated to maximize mental damage. Medical examination of remains from mass graves suggests the physical injuries were often less severe than the psychological trauma they were designed to inflict. Pregnancy from these encounters served specific purposes beyond reproduction. Pregnant. Captives couldn't escape easily and were psychologically bound to their situations. Children born from the violence became additional control mechanisms, hostages that prevented mothers from attempting suicide or rebellion. Viking legal codes from Iceland describe property rights in such children, treating them as assets rather than people. The breeding programs were systematic. High-status captive women were paired with specific Norse warriors based on desired traits and offspring. Physical appearance, intelligence, noble bloodlines. These factors determined mating assignments. The children weren't bastards in Viking society. They were legitimate heirs who carried both Norse and conquered bloodlines, useful for future political arrangements. Record-keeping was meticulous. Runic inscriptions found in Denmark and Sweden list captive women by original names, current designations, breeding assignments, and offspring produced. These weren't personal journals. They were administrative documents treating human beings as livestock. The systematic nature of the documentation shows this was organized policy, not individual brutality. Training for new roles began once the mind-breaking was complete. Captive queens learned to serve food to their former enemies. Noble daughters were taught to clean weapons and maintain armor. Abbesses practiced pagan rituals and renounced Christian vows. The reversals were intentional, forcing victims to betray everything they had previously valued. The training included performance requirements. Broken captives had to demonstrate enthusiasm for their new roles, not just compliance. A former queen serving mead to Viking warriors had to smile convincingly while doing it. This forced emotional display added another layer of psychological damage. Victims had to betray their own feelings as well as their previous lives. Language coaching continued throughout the process. Captive women learned to praise their captors, express gratitude for their treatment, and denounce their previous lives as meaningless. These weren't spontaneous declarations. They were scripted performances designed to reinforce psychological submission while providing propaganda value for Viking audiences. Display protocols maximized the impact. Broken war brides were paraded at important gatherings, feasts, religious ceremonies, diplomatic meetings. Their presence served multiple purposes. It demonstrated Viking power to allies and enemies. It reinforced the consequences of resistance. It provided entertainment for warriors who enjoyed seeing former enemies reduced to servile roles. The psychological techniques spread across Viking culture. Icelandic sagas describe similar methods used on captive women from Scotland, Ireland, and England. The consistency suggests these weren't improvised cruelties, but established procedures taught to warriors and passed down through generations. The mind-breaking process became as standardized as weapon maintenance or ship construction. Medical understanding supported the methods. Viking society included individuals who understood how human psychology functioned under extreme stress. They knew which techniques would cause permanent damage and which would produce temporary submission. The difference between breaking someone temporarily and destroying them completely was well understood and applied strategically. Long-term maintenance of broken captives required ongoing attention. The psychological damage wasn't self-sustaining. Without continued reinforcement, someone began recovering their original personalities. Guards were trained to recognize signs of mental recovery and apply corrective measures before full psychological healing could occur. Suicide prevention was crucial for protecting valuable assets. Captive women often attempted to kill themselves rather than endure continued existence as broken shells of their former selves. Vikings developed techniques to prevent these deaths: constant observation, removal of potential weapons, binding methods that made self-harm impossible. The goal was preserving the investment, not protecting the individual. Some captives developed secondary personalities as survival mechanisms. These women would display complete submission to their captors while maintaining hidden core identities. The split personality approach allowed them to endure the degradation while preserving some sense of self. Vikings learned to recognize this psychological defense and developed countermeasures. Economic value drove many decisions about treatment and training. A properly broken queen could be sold to enemies of her original kingdom for substantial sums. Her presence in an enemy court, serving and praising those who had destroyed her people, was worth more than mere ransom money. The psychological warfare value exceeded traditional economic calculations. Political marriages used broken captives strategically. A mind-broken princess could be married to a rival king as part of a peace treaty. Her inability to function as a proper queen would gradually undermine her new husband's authority while strengthening Viking influence in the region. These arrangements were long-term psychological warfare disguised as diplomacy. The children produced by broken war brides faced specific fates. Boys were often raised as Vikings with full rights, while girls were trained for eventual use as diplomatic tools or breeding stock. The mixed bloodlines were valuable for establishing claims to conquered territories or negotiating future alliances with surviving noble families. Documentation of successful cases was preserved for training purposes. Younger Vikings learned the mind-breaking techniques by studying detailed accounts of previous operations. The knowledge was passed down like any other military skill, sword work, navigation, or siege warfare. Breaking human minds was considered as important as breaking enemy shields. Resistance methods were studied and countered. Some women attempted to maintain psychological integrity through prayer, meditation, or mental exercises. Vikings learned to recognize these defensive techniques and developed specific countermeasures. The psychological warfare became increasingly sophisticated as both sides adapted their methods. Recovery was rarely complete, even for rescued captives. Former war brides who were eventually freed or ransomed showed lasting psychological damage. Contemporary accounts describe women who couldn't remember their original names, couldn't function in their former social roles, or couldn't form normal relationships with family members. The mind-breaking process created permanent changes that persisted for years. The practice spread beyond Viking territories. Byzantine military manuals from the 10th century describe similar psychological techniques used against captured enemies. Islamic sources reference comparable methods employed during conquest campaigns. The systematic destruction of human psychology became a recognized military tactic across multiple cultures. Training facilities were established in major Viking settlements. Archaeological excavations at Hedeby have uncovered buildings specifically designed for holding and processing captive women. The structures include soundproof chambers, restraint systems, and observation areas that match descriptions in historical sources. These weren't improvised accommodations. They were purpose-built psychological warfare installations. The process typically took between 7 and 14 days to achieve complete mental breakdown. Experienced operators could reduce this time for weaker subjects or extend it for particularly resilient victims. The timing was crucial. Too fast, and the damage might not be permanent. Too slow, and the victim might develop effective psychological defenses. Quality control ensured consistent results. Master practitioners evaluated the work of apprentice mind-breakers, providing feedback and additional training as needed. The systematic approach treated psychological destruction as a craft requiring skill development and practice. Successful operators were valued members of Viking warbands. The techniques were documented in runic inscriptions that served as instruction manuals. These carvings, found across Scandinavia, provided step-by-step guidance for breaking different types of captives. The inscriptions were coded to prevent enemies from understanding the methods, but Viking warriors could decode them for training purposes. Regional variations developed based on local preferences and available resources. Norse settlements in Ireland specialized in breaking Celtic noblewomen. Danish raiders focused on Frankish and Saxon targets. Swedish Vikings developed techniques specifically for Slavic captives. The core principles remained constant, but implementation details varied by region. The practice began declining in the late 10th century as Christian influence grew in Scandinavia. Church leaders condemned the mind-breaking techniques as contrary to Christian values. Kings who converted to Christianity officially banned the practices, though enforcement was inconsistent. Economic changes also reduced demand for broken war brides as political tools. Legal codes gradually criminalized the worst aspects of the process. The Glading Law from Norway, written around 1000 CE, specifically banned the psychological torture of captive women. Similar provisions appeared in Danish and Swedish legal texts. These laws marked the beginning of the end for systematic mind-breaking as standard military practice. The last documented cases appear in sources from the mid-11th century. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions the capture and breaking of Queen Elfgifu of Mercia in 1043, but describes it as an unusual occurrence rather than standard practice. By this time, most Viking raiders had adopted more conventional approaches to handling captive women. Archaeological evidence from a mass grave near Uppsala reveals the final chapter of this dark practice. Excavations in 1987 uncovered remains of 23 women, all showing signs of extreme psychological trauma manifested in physical symptoms, stress fractures from repetitive restraint, malnutrition patterns consistent with controlled feeding, dental damage from forced jaw clenching. The burial dates to approximately 1050 CE. Chemical analysis of their teeth shows isotope patterns from across northern Europe, Ireland, Scotland, England, and France. These women had been transported hundreds of miles from their homes to die as broken shells in a foreign land. The grave goods include shattered jewelry and torn fabric, remnants of their original high status, buried with the hollow remnants of who they once were before Viking warlords decided their minds were worth more destroyed than intact.